Hey guys, welcome to Useless Historian. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to a time before buildings, before farming, before names were even written down. A time when the cold didn't knock, it waited outside like a predator. When the night wasn't quiet, it listened. And in the center of it all was fire. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about what fire gave us beyond warmth, memory, connection, pause, and presence. The first tool that didn't just change our world, it changed who we were becoming. So get comfortable, let your breath slow down. We're going to walk through the long dark and sit beside the glow that once made us human. If you find yourself drifting off during the story, that's okay, that's kind of the point. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe, give the video a like, and share it with someone who loves quiet stories as much as you do. Drop a comment below and let me know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Now, let's begin. The first time fire was more than just light. They had seen fire before, of course, from a distance. In the sky when it cracked open in storms, in trees that bled light after a strike, in the grass when the dry season turned the land to tinder. But fire had always belonged to the world, not to them. It was a thing to fear, to flee from, to watch from behind stones and under firs. It came quickly, roared louder than hunger, and left nothing but smoke and black dust behind. But this was different. It didn't start with a storm, it didn't race across a plain. It flickered, quietly, on purpose, in a circle dug by hands, contained by rocks that had names, fed by wood that had been chosen and placed in just the right way. Fire, and this time, they hadn't run from it, they had made it stay. It wasn't just light. It wasn't even just heat. Not now. Now it was company. It was the center of the night, a place to gather not out of fear, but out of something else they didn't yet have a word for. They stared into it not because it burned, but because it moved like something alive. And for the first time, the darkness wasn't the only thing moving. Shadows danced, but they belonged to people now. The flickering orange on the walls of the cave wasn't chaos. It was shape, form, a silent story. And in the quiet that followed the hunt, after the eating and the sharing and the settling down, the fire stayed. It stayed when the words ran out. It stayed when the cold curled around the edges of the shelter. It stayed when eyes grew heavy, and that changed everything. Fire had turned into something more than survival. They could feel it in the way their hands reached for it, not to touch, but to warm, in the way their bodies sat closer together now, as if the space between them had softened. They didn't all speak the same way, not yet, but they didn't need to. The fire was saying something already, in the pops and sighs of the wood, in the slow lean of a branch collapsing into coal, in the way it didn't leave, unless you let it. Someone fed it, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That was new, that was different. It meant something had shifted, the same way a mother watches a child breathe, the same way one hunter watches another's back. The flame had been invited, and accepted. And so they stayed up a little longer that night, watching, listening, breathing in smoke and warmth like it was a language, like it was history being made without knowing it. The children stopped asking questions, they just watched, eyes wide, reflecting fire. The elders stopped explaining things, they just listened, as if the fire had the answers already. And maybe it did, because fire didn't just chase away the cold, it brought a kind of stillness, a kind of safety that hadn't existed before. They weren't just surviving, they were being awake, together, unafraid. The next day would bring the hunt again, the search for roots, for water, for shelter, the work of staying alive. But that night, for just a while, the world felt smaller, and warmer, and quieter, all because of the flicker they didn't run from, all because of fire when it became more than light. When warmth meant the difference between life and waiting, it didn't take long before they began to understand. Warmth wasn't just comfort, it was a marker of time, of safety, of who belonged and who didn't. When the winds shifted and the long season of cold began, you didn't count days by the sky, you counted by the fire, how long it burned, how long you could feel your toes, how long it took the shivers to stop. Once you curled beside the glowing coals, before warmth, survival had been movement. Keep walking, keep chasing, keep fleeing the cold before it sank too deep into the joints and settled behind the eyes. But fire changed that. Now they had something they could carry, something they could build, a pocket of sun in the middle of ice and wind. and that warmth, it changed everything. They no longer had to wait for spring to return in silence. Now they could wait around something. Together, the fire was a center, not just of camp, but of meaning. It drew them inward, not just physically, but quietly, emotionally. It was where the stories began, where memory softened, where eyes closed slowly, instead of from exhaustion, where breath didn't rush, it lingered. You could tell who had learned the old lessons, just by how they treated the fire. Some crouched too close, greedy for heat, their skin blistered in warning. Others sat just far enough, patient, letting the warmth reach them on its own time. The elders didn't have to say a word. The children learned just by watching, who added kindling with care, who stirred the ash gently, who blew too hard, and who knew to whisper their breath instead. Warmth wasn't about temperature, it was about presence. When you could feel it, you knew you weren't alone, that someone had kept it alive, that someone had stayed up when others slept, that someone had remembered the way the bark curls, the way the moss dries faster, near the edge of the trees, the way flint sparks only when it's angled just right. Warmth was memory, passed down not in words, but in glowing hands and tired eyes that never let the flame die. There were nights when it almost went out, when the wind howled louder than the fire crackled, when the wood had all turned to damp pulp and the coals shrank to whispers beneath their own ash. And those were the nights you remembered what waiting used to mean. Waiting for the sun, waiting for a break in the frost, waiting for the body to warm itself, and sometimes failing. Now they didn't wait alone. Warmth was shared. If you had it, you gave it. If someone stumbled in from the dark, a hunter late from the trail, a forager who lost their path, they weren't questioned. They were drawn close, covered, pressed into the fold of the group where breath met breath, not because of kindness, but because the warmth only worked if it spread. It was not a gift to be kept. It was a bond to be passed along. Even food tasted different in warmth. Meat softened, roots yielded, hands didn't tremble as they fed others, eyes met more easily. Conversations, slow, simple ones, stretched longer. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming something else, something slower, something more human. And in those nights with fire in the center and warmth at their backs, they could imagine a future, not the next hunt, not the next storm, but further. They could imagine the little one at the edge of the circle growing up, the pregnant woman carrying a child who would one day feed this same fire. They could imagine that what they were building might last longer than frost, because warmth taught them what time really was, not hours or days, but how long someone could wait beside you, how long the flame could last when everyone shared it, how long they could sit together in silence, with nothing but breath and ember and soft cracks in the dark. It was the warmth that held them in place, and slowly, without knowing the word for it, they had stopped just surviving. They had started living. The night the wind tried to steal it all. It began with a sound, not sudden, not violent, just a low, steady whisper that slid down the hillside and crept along the ground like it had always belonged there. The trees swayed first, barely, just enough for a few dry leaves to rattle loose. Then the grass followed, bending not backward, but sideways, as if bowing to something they couldn't see. That was the kind of wind it was, not loud, but certain, a wind that didn't arrive with noise, but with intent. Inside the shelter, they felt it before they heard it. A shift in the pressure, a breath held too long by the world around them, and then, a crack, not from the fire, but from the lashings holding the shelter wall. The stitched hide fluttered at the edge, then flapped, then lifted, like something was trying to pull it free. Someone reached for it, held it down with both hands, but already the air inside had changed. The fire flickered. The heat staggered. The flame shrank back. It wasn't the first time the wind had tested them. They had built for it. The wind came with the season, as predictable as hunger, and just as cruel. But this night was different. This wind didn't just pull. It searched. It snuck into corners, found the holes, widened them. It didn't roar. It whispered, over and over, like it was asking something, asking for what they had built, asking to see what they dared to keep. The fire began to tremble. At first, it was just the smoke, drawn sideways, then downward, then spinning into strange patterns before disappearing. Then the flame itself leaned, hard to one side, licking the air like it was being dragged. Someone cupped their hands around it, tried to shield it. Another threw a thicker log on, hoping the weight would settle the fire. But the wind didn't care about weight. It found the gaps between the wood. It wrapped itself around the base, and breathed its cold breath straight through the heart of the flame. It wasn't about heat anymore. It was about survival. They moved fast, like they'd practiced. The moss pouch, the flint stone, a small pile of dry splinters tucked beneath the sleeping skins. They tried to recenter the fire, to bring it back. But every time it flared, the wind leaned harder, not gusting, leaning, like a long cold hand pushing just enough to unmake all that had been built. No one spoke, not because of fear, but because words wasted breath, and they needed all of it. Children were pressed close to the elders, skins were pulled tighter around shoulders. They made a wall of bodies to guard what little glow remained, but it was fading fast. Someone whispered a story, not to tell it, but to remember it. It was about the time the wind took the fire from another camp, a group that hadn't built their wall right, who had waited too long to anchor their furs. The story had always felt distant. Now, it was right outside the flap, crawling in with the air that made their bones ache. And then, the moment, the fire went out. No warning, no protest, just a long breath of wind, a shiver of coals, and then dark, true dark. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, satisfied. But they weren't defeated, not yet. Not when they still remembered. The one with the flint didn't wait. They dropped to their knees, scraped once, twice, 3 times. A spark caught in the moss. Another hand cupped around it. Breath, careful, steady. Another flake of wood, dry and thin. And then, glow. It wasn't fire yet, but it was hope. Hope caught fire faster than moss. It spread, not as flame, but in the eyes of those watching. A little spark became a curl of smoke. Smoke became an orange thread. The thread became a flicker, and the flicker became flame. They rebuilt it right there, in the wind, with bare fingers and clenched teeth, with memory, with stubbornness, with the weight of all the nights that had come before. When the fire was strong again, low, but steady, they didn't speak, they just looked at it, and then each other, then out into the dark, where the wind had gone quiet, not gone, just watching, waiting, because the wind didn't need to take everything at once, it only needed one weak night, and they had made sure this was not going to be that night. How sparks became stories. At first, sparks were just the promise of fire, a flicker, a brief betrayal of the dark, nothing more than a heartbeat of orange and white, vanishing before it even truly arrived. But over time, after hundreds of nights, thousands of tries, countless failed attempts with stone and stick, the spark itself began to mean something more. It was no longer just the beginning of heat. It became the beginning of attention, of silence, of watching something happen that felt larger than a single flame. They didn't know what friction was. Not yet. They didn't have names for heat or reaction or fuel, but they knew effort. They knew the rhythm of grinding, the patience of shaving bark to its thinnest, the breath held when the first wisp of smoke curled up from a spark and didn't disappear right away, and when that happened, when it didn't vanish. People gathered, not just to help, but to see, because something about that tiny flare of light against a background of endless cold and night felt like a story was starting. They didn't tell it out loud, not always. The first stories didn't need words. They happened in glances, in the way someone's hand paused, hovered near the spark, in the way a child leaned in, wide-eyed, as though witnessing a kind of magic, in the way the oldest among them nodded slightly, as though they had seen it all before, and yet still waited to see it again. And once the fire took, once it breathed its first steady breath and spread from dry moss to thin twig to split wood, something else started too. The stories that did have words, not all at once, sometimes just a name, or a warning, sometimes a laugh, sometimes a whisper about the last time the fire had been so stubborn, or the time the wind had nearly stolen it, or when someone made it spark from nothing but a broken stone no one thought could do anything. These weren't stories for telling later. They were told around the fire, with the fire. The sparks weren't just a beginning for flame, they were the trigger for memory. The way light danced across the cave wall reminded them of movement, of chase, of loss, of finding something again. And when someone mimicked that movement with their hands, when fingers traced shadows in the glow, a new kind of story was born, one you didn't need to understand fully to feel. The sparks taught them something beginnings mattered, that a thing could come from almost nothing. If watched, protected, breathed into, a story could too. It was said, quietly, and only among those who had watched many fires, that sparks were alive, that each one held its own small truth. Not all of them would catch, some would fade, quick and invisible, but others, if given the right kind of attention, could turn into something that stayed, something that gave warmth, something that could last long after the hands that made it had fallen still. That's what a spark really was, not just heat, not just light, but the start of something worth gathering around. The ash that marked a new kind of memory. The fire always left something behind. Even after the last ember dimmed, after the final coal cracked into silence, there was ash, light as breath. Cold to the touch, it covered everything the flame had eaten. Sticks, bark, bone, leaf, scrap, all of it reduced to this soft, pale grey that drifted with the faintest breeze. And for a long time, they might have thought it was just the end of something. But ash stayed, and that changed everything. Before fire, there was nothing left to mark where a night had been lived, no trace of where a meal had been shared, no proof of warmth, no sign that people had once gathered, shoulder to shoulder, around something glowing. But now, after fire, there was always ash. A stain on the rock, a dusting on the cave floor, a pale outline, where hands had pressed into the ground to get closer. It didn't go away, it lingered. Days after the fire moved on, and so did the memory of what had happened there. One day, someone noticed that their footprint stayed behind, outlined in ash. Another saw the shape of a child's hand in the dust near the hearth. A finger traced it, slowly, not to erase, but to remember, because the ash held still what the night had already forgotten. The warmth might have vanished, but this was the memory of warmth, made visible, and so they began to notice more. The way the ash darkened when mixed with grease, the way it stuck to cracked skin, marked faces, the way it fell in strange patterns. When the wind curled through the entrance of the shelter, the stories told around the fire didn't vanish. They settled in the ash, in the places where someone had laughed, where someone had wept, where someone had been remembered after they were gone. Ash made the ground sacred, not because it was holy, not in the way we think of that word now, but because it meant something had happened, something worth staying for. It marked not just survival, but gathering, connection, time itself. There were places where the ash piled high, not cleaned, not brushed away, left intentionally, layer after layer, old fires, new ones, all on top of each other. Generations walked on it without knowing whose footsteps had come before, but they felt it. They knew this was not just any place. This was the place where fire had once lived, and where people had lived beside it. In time, some of them began to draw in it. Simple things at first. A line, a circle, the mark of a leaf pressed gently, then removed, and then other things, shapes, curves, the idea of a story, left behind without sound, a message not shouted across a valley, but whispered across time. Not everyone could read it. Maybe no one fully could. But the act itself of marking was memory. When someone died, the ash was stirred, not to erase, but to mix, to scatter part of what had once held life into the space where life would continue. Some of it clung to hands for days afterward, to hair, to skin. They didn't wash it away. They let it fall off slowly, like the past shedding gently, in its own time. And that was the lesson of ash, that not everything burned was lost. Some things stayed, not as flame, but as dust that remembered. Why the flame became the center of everything. It didn't happen all at once. The first fires were kept because of need, because warmth meant the difference between sleep and death, because light held the darkness back, because cooked meat was softer, easier, safer. But over time, slowly, and almost without anyone realizing it, the flame moved inward, not just physically, to the center of the shelter, the camp, the cave, but into the center of something far deeper. It became the pulse. It didn't matter how large the group was, 5 people or 15, sleeping under one roof or scattered between caves. The fire was always at the center. Everything happened around it. Everything returned to it. And it wasn't just practical, it was something else. Something older than language, but deeper than instinct. The flame became where the day ended and where the night began. It was the place of rest, of sharing, of silence, of stories. Children were born near it. Names were whispered over it. Meat was passed hand to hand in its flickering glow. Disagreements were ended beside it. Jokes were told in its shadow. And sometimes, when someone passed, they were remembered by the shape of how they once sat, just there, just where the coals still held heat from a fire long gone. Even when no one spoke, the fire was a conversation. Its crackling was a language, its sparks, a kind of punctuation. The flame didn't just provide, it responded. If someone added wood too quickly, it hissed. If someone fed it slowly, patiently, it rewarded with long, steady light. It wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a presence. Not alive, not exactly, but not entirely lifeless, either. And so people started building around it differently. The circle came first, stones ringed around the fire to hold it still, then seats, not carved or formal, but worn places where the same feet stepped, where the same hips rested. They began sleeping in semicircles, heads tilted toward the flame, not away. Tools were left nearby, not scattered, but arranged, always within reach. It shaped space, not by design, but by belonging. The first shelters were built with the fire in mind, not for warmth alone, but for sight lines, so everyone could see it, and see each other in its light. So even in silence, in the deepest hours of night, no one ever truly felt alone, because as long as the flame was alive, something was awake, watching, waiting, holding space for whatever might come. They started calling meetings by it, not meetings in the way we know them, but gatherings of decision. When someone had to leave, when someone returned, when something strange was seen near the trees, when a sound was heard that no one could explain. They didn't shout across the camp, they waited until everyone was seated, until the fire was breathing well, until its rhythm matched theirs, and then they began to speak. You could tell what kind of night it was by the way people sat near the fire. Some nights, close and tight, shoulders brushing. Other nights, wide and quiet, the air between them heavy with thought, but always they returned to it. Always they faced it, and always they left it burning, even if just a coal, as though afraid to let the world go completely dark, because the fire held more than heat. It held memory, it held presence. It marked time not in hours or minutes, but in stories. How long it took for someone to cry, how long it took for someone to forgive, how long a child could stay awake before their eyes closed beside the coals. It was the calendar, the clock, the journal. There were no drawings on the walls that didn't begin in firelight. No plan made that didn't start with someone scratching into dirt beside the flames. No song hummed that didn't find its first breath there. The fire wasn't in the center by accident. It was there because it had to be, because everything else bent around it, and when they moved, as they often did, they carried the flame. Not the whole thing, but a piece of it, in a shell, in a stone, in a pouch wrapped in dry moss. They didn't always succeed. Sometimes it died, and when it did, the silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was grief. The flame wasn't a possession, it was a member of the group, and when it was gone, something essential went missing with it. But when they arrived somewhere new and breathed life into it again, when the fire rose once more, the space changed, the place became theirs, the circle formed, the voices softened, the warmth spread, and once again, the center was whole, because the flame had never been just fire, it had become the heart. When fire was safer than the sun was distant, unreachable. It ruled from high above, brilliant and unyielding, but it gave nothing you could touch. You could look toward it, though not for long. You could wait for its rise, track its path, feel its warmth on your skin for a few hours, but you could not keep it. You could not carry it. You could not ask it to stay. It was not cruel, not exactly, but it was indifferent. The sun belonged to everything, to the birds, the stones, the riverbanks, the tallest tree and the driest sand. It shone the same on your face as it did on the animal that wanted to kill you. Its light meant day, and day meant exposure, to hunger, to predators, to others like you who were desperate for the same water, the same shelter, the same fleeting sense of safety. The sun didn't wait for you to be ready. It didn't care if your wounds still bled, or your breath still trembled from the night before. It rose anyway, cold or not, hungry or not, grieving or not. And when it reached its highest point, it pressed down on your skin like it wanted to flatten you, dry your lips, crack your knuckles, bake the world into dust. Fire, though, fire was different. Fire asked for something, and in return it gave something. A trade, not a tyranny. You offered time, attention, fuel, breath, and it gave back warmth, protection. Light you could choose, flame that you could sit beside, shape with your hands, feed like a living thing. Fire responded. Fire could be coaxed. Fire could be trusted to stay if you kept your promise. The sun could blind you. Fire could teach you. The sun might show you the way, but fire showed you where to stop, where to rest, where to gather, and be still. It was the fire, not the sun, that turned strangers into companions, even if only for one night. Around it, eyes softened, words came easier. Even silence felt different, more forgiving, more full. And unlike the sun, fire could be hidden. It could be shielded behind rock, held in cupped palms, buried beneath ash until morning. You could tuck it into a pouch, carry it across great distances, whisper to it when you were alone in the woods and needed something familiar to remind you still existed. You couldn't explain that to the sun, but fire understood. There were times when they feared the day more than the night, when the creatures they couldn't name moved with the heat and dust, when the brightness meant being seen, being chased, being caught. The sun did not protect, it only illuminated. But fire stayed awake with you. Fire didn't rise and leave. It pulsed gently beside your feet. It hissed softly at the wind. It warned the wild things that someone was near, someone with sparks and strength and enough will to keep the dark at bay. When the days were long and merciless, they waited for dusk, not because they welcomed the dark, but because they could finally light the fire again. Not just for warmth, but for home. A fire meant you'd made it, you'd endured another stretch of heat, hunger, exposure. The fire didn't laugh or speak, but it recognized your return, and you knew as the flames rose and the shadows danced against the rocks that you had something the sun could never offer. You had control, you had choice, you had something that listened. And so slowly they began to choose the fire over the sun, not in reverence but in preference. They honored the flame, not for its power, but for its humility. It didn't tower, it didn't blind, it sat with you, close enough to touch. And for that reason, in the oldest corners of memory, there were those who believed the fire was a gift the sun could never give, and maybe never meant to. Because fire didn't belong to the sky, it belonged to us. The taste that changed when we cooked. They didn't know the word cooking, not yet. There were no recipes, no spice blends, no idea of flavor beyond what was chewed and swallowed. Food was survival, and taste was a secondary concern, if it was even considered at all. Raw meant tough, bitter, cold. It meant tearing with the jaw, grinding with teeth worn flat from grit. It meant effort, and often discomfort, but it also meant life, and that was enough. Then one day, no one could say when, or where, or who first dared it. Something fell into the fire. Maybe it was an accident. A scrap of meat dropped from a bone, a root left too close to the coals, a marrow-filled femur that rolled just far enough into the heat to blacken and hiss. Someone noticed the change, not just in scent, but in texture, in color, and when they tasted it, everything was different. It was softer, warmer, the bitterness was gone, replaced by something else, a depth, a sweetness, a richness that made the body pause, then want more. The fire hadn't just warmed the food, it had transformed it, it had made it something new, and suddenly, taste began to matter. Before fire, you ate because you had to. After fire, you ate because you wanted to. Hunger became layered, the belly still growled, but now the mouth did too. People began to remember the smell of singed meat, the texture of crisped fat, the sweetness of a roasted tuber. They began to notice which parts of the animal tasted best when cooked, which woods made better smelling smoke, which stones held heat long enough to bake something slow. The fire changed the way food felt. It shifted from a chore into a ritual. They began to gather around it, not just for warmth, but to wait, to smell, to anticipate. The slow turning of a stick over flame became a kind of attention, a kind of care, and the food that emerged from it was more than fuel. It was memory. You remembered the good meals, the ones where the bark didn't burn too fast, where the meat didn't fall into the ash, where the outside crisped and the inside stayed soft. It was survival, yes, but it was something else too, a kind of pride. There were preferences now. Some liked it darker, some liked it smoked, slow cooked in buried pits. Some figured out how to roast roots until they broke apart in the hand, sweet and hot like sun-soaked earth, and slowly across thousands of fires, around thousands of mouths, a new sense awakened. Taste wasn't just what food was, it was how it felt when shared. The oldest elders could tell stories through taste. This, they'd say with a nod, tastes like when the river flooded, and we ate nothing but charred bark and boiled weeds. Or this tastes like the spring the wild pigs returned, and we cooked them over cedar, and no one went hungry. Taste became tied to place, to season, to memory, to people, and with that came caution. Some things were made safer by fire. Mushrooms that killed when raw shrank harmlessly in heat. Meat that carried unseen sickness cooked until it steamed, the danger curling away like smoke. Fire revealed what the eyes couldn't. It warned you when something smelled wrong. It hissed when too much fat dripped too fast. It told you without words, not yet, or too long, or perfect now. Children learned not by instruction, but by watching, by seeing the way meat changed color near the coals, by listening to the sounds it made, by smelling the air when it was nearly done. They learned that patience made better food, that rushing led to bitterness or waste. They learned to feed the fire and the belly, and in time the very act of cooking became sacred. Not in the way of temples and chants, but in a quiet, everyday reverence. The fire was approached with purpose. Food was prepared with attention. Eating was not just about filling, it was about noticing. And so the taste that changed when we cooked became more than a sense, it became a connection. Between the person who caught the animal and the one who prepared it. Between the one who gathered roots and the one who knew when they were ready. Between generations, who remembered meals not by dates but by smells. You could be gone from the camp for days, weeks, but the smell of roasted meat, the warmth of the fire, the crisp edge of fat on the tongue, that would bring you back. Because the fire didn't just make food taste better, it made food mean something. How smoke taught us to wait. It was the smoke you noticed first, not the flame. Flame was quick, bright, urgent. It danced, it begged for fuel. It pulled your attention like a child tugging on a sleeve. But smoke was different. It didn't ask for anything. It simply moved, slow, curling, quiet. It slipped between things. It lingered. It warned. Before fire was a tool, it was a mystery, and smoke was its whisper. They learned early that smoke meant something was changing. Wood becoming heat, fat becoming scent, food becoming flavor, the air shifting from empty to full. And when the smoke came soft in long ribbons that rose gently into the air, they knew things were going right. That the fire was stable, that the meat was cooking, that it was time to wait. Smoke taught them patience. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't pull the food off too soon. If you did, it was still raw, still tough, still clinging to the danger that fire was meant to drive out. But if you waited, if you trusted the time and watched the smoke, something else happened. The smell changed. The color shifted. The meat softened. The air itself told you when it was ready. They didn't have clocks. They had the way smoke moved, the way it darkened, then lightened, the way it clung to hair, to hide, to the roof of the mouth. You could tell how long something had been cooking by the weight of smoke on your tongue, and if the smoke was wrong, too black, too thick, too bitter, they knew to pull back, to adjust, to wait longer. It became part of their rhythm, part of the ritual, not just something to breathe or avoid, but something to understand. Smoke rose slowly, and so they moved slowly. They sat near the fire, not over it. They leaned back. They talked in lower tones. You couldn't shout when smoke was in your throat. You couldn't run through the cooking space. You had to be still. And in that stillness, they learned more than how to cook. They learned how to watch. The direction of smoke told them where the wind was going, which meant where scent would carry, how close predators might be, where to place their shelters. If it drifted low, they knew rain was coming. If it scattered fast, the storm had already passed. But most of all, smoke taught them to stay, because you couldn't carry smoke with you. You had to remain until it faded, until it finished, until the work of the fire was done. And that waiting, that being there, became its own kind of bond. You sat by the smoke with others. You listened to stories while it curled through your hair. You watched your child fall asleep in its haze. You sat in silence and remembered the people who used to sit beside you, whose voices still seemed to echo in the spaces between each drift of grey. The smoke marked time in moments, not in numbers. It taught you how long it took to prepare something worth sharing. It taught you that the best things, the safest food, the warmest coals, the deepest flavor, came only after stillness, and it stayed long after the fire was gone, in your clothes, in your breath, in your memory. It was the ghost of a meal, of a night, of a moment spent waiting beside heat and listening to its voice. And every time the smoke returned, it brought the old memories with it, and asked you to be patient once again. So when the fire sparked and the smoke began to rise, no one rushed, no one demanded. They sat, they watched, they waited. Because smoke didn't just feed the body, it fed something slower, something deeper. The circle that formed around the embers. It wasn't a rule, no one said where to sit. There were no drawn lines in the dirt, no stones to mark the shape, no voice to call out, gather here. But still, the bodies came, one by one, and they sat, always in a circle, always around the embers. Not the fire, at first. The embers, that low, pulsing red at the base of the flames. Quiet, steady, like a heart, still beating long after the voice has stopped. It was around that quiet heat they formed themselves. Legs crossed, backs curved, hands out, palms open toward the glow, without thinking, without needing to explain it. The circle was instinct. It was the natural shape of sharing, of seeing each other, of passing meat hand to hand, of dividing the warmth equally. Everyone could see the fire. Everyone could see each other. No backs turned, no one hidden. You knew where everyone was. You knew who was missing. And when the fire burned high, the circle widened. When it sank into coals, they drew closer. Not for ceremony, but survival. The heat didn't travel far, especially in the wind. And so the circle lived and breathed with the flame, growing, shrinking, tightening, loosening, but always returning, always reforming, as though the people, like the fire itself, had learned how to live in rhythm. Children learned to sit low, knees tucked, eyes wide. They passed sticks between them, poked at the edge of the ash, asked questions in whispers. Elders sat upright, shoulders squared, speaking only when the moment asked for it. Others sat with their arms around knees, leaning into the heat, listening more than speaking. The circle wasn't just warmth, it was memory. You remembered where someone used to sit, even after they were gone. The hollow in the dirt stayed longer than the voice. And when someone new came to the group, they found themselves guided, gently, wordlessly, to a space in the shape of belonging. It became a place of decision. Arguments waited for the circle, announcements, too. When someone returned from a long walk, or when a hunt failed, or when something strange had been seen near the trees, they told the story here, in the light, in the center, where faces could be read and silences could be heard. They learned that no one stayed outside the circle unless they were angry or afraid, and even then, the warmth reached out to them. The fire didn't turn its back, it flickered in invitation, waiting, holding space, and over time, the shape of the fire changed too. It became round, stones were placed not randomly, but in arcs, wood was arranged in triangles, pointing inward, heat radiated more evenly. The flame stood at the center, not towering, not wild, but balanced, like the flame understood it had been given a role. And then there was the language of the circle, not words though many were spoken, but looks, movements, the way someone passed a bone without speaking, the way someone leaned in closer when a story began, the way a silence was kept when someone's eyes fell low. You didn't have to explain things here, you just were, and that was enough. Some circles were large, 2 fires, or 3, placed nearby, with people orbiting in shifting clusters. Other nights, when the weather turned cruel and the world felt sharp, the circle shrank to just a few, a tighter ring, a closer hum, huddled backs forming a shield against the wind, but always a circle, always the shape of gathering, because something in the human mind knew corners didn't comfort, walls didn't soothe, but a ring of bodies, all facing in, that was safety, that was memory, that was home. And when sleep came, it came from the circle too. One by one, heads lowered, shoulders sank, the conversation faded into humming, sparks rose and fell, and rose again. The embers glowed beneath a shell of ash, still warm, still alive. The circle never fully broke. Even in dreams, it held. Even in silence, it remained. Because this was the first architecture humans truly understood. Not buildings, not fences, but each other, arranged gently around the beating heart of flame. Why fire meant sleep could finally come. Sleep used to be the most dangerous thing you could do. Before fire, closing your eyes meant giving up your last defense. It meant choosing stillness in a world that never stopped moving. The forest didn't sleep. The wind didn't. The predators surely didn't. Even the insects had no need for rest. They simply shifted from one shadow to the next. And so, early humans didn't truly sleep. Not the way we do now. They dozed. They waited. They leaned against trees, curled under rock shelves, buried themselves in brush and braced for anything. One ear, always open. One eye, half-lidded. They survived the night, but they didn't rest. Fire changed that. The first time they saw flame hold its shape through the night, something shifted. The flicker of it, constant and alive, was like a second set of eyes, a silent watchman. When it crackled, it meant nothing had crept too close. When it flared, it meant someone had added more fuel. When it smoldered low, it meant the night was halfway over and still, they were safe. It was the only thing between them and what hunted in the dark, and it was enough. Before fire, night was a time to fear, to hide, to hope for morning. But now, night became something else, something almost sacred. With fire, you could see the faces around you. You could warm your limbs before sleep. You could speak softly without being overheard by the wild. And when you finally lay back on a woven bed of hide and dry moss, you weren't doing so in desperation. You were doing it in peace. Because fire was watching now. The mind changed, slowly but surely. Where once it had been hardwired to remain alert long after the sun had gone, now it found permission to let go, to drift, to trust. And with trust came real sleep, not shallow rest, but something deeper, the kind of sleep that healed the body, slowed the heart, and planted the seeds of dreaming. Dreams became possible around the fire. And once the mind began to dream, the world began to open in entirely new ways. You didn't need to take turns staying awake. Not always. The fire didn't get tired. It didn't blink. As long as someone stirred it before the embers faded, the circle could remain intact, safe, quiet, glowing. Even the animals came to understand the line it drew. The fire was a signal. This space is claimed. This warmth is spoken for. And that changed everything. For the first time in human memory, rest wasn't just a necessity. It was a choice. You could decide when to sleep, not just collapse from exhaustion. You could sleep through the coldest hours, not shiver through them. You could lie beside your child, or your mate, and not wake with dread at the rustling of leaves. You could trust the night not to take you. With rest came strength, with strength came thought, and with thought came a kind of dreaming that didn't end when the eyes opened. You began to plan. You remembered what the fire looked like when it burned best. You remembered how you had slept when the circle was tight and the fuel was dry. Sleep, once rare and dangerous, became a tool, a secret weapon. The more they rested, the more they imagined. And the more they imagined, the more they could shape the world. People began to associate sleep, not with fear, but with comfort. With rituals, they sang quietly before lying down. They placed special stones near the fire's edge. Some kept a stick in hand while drifting off, just in case they needed to stir the coals by instinct. Others took turns being the last to sleep, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted the fire's final flickers all to themselves. Even in sleep, fire left its mark. Ash clung to hair, to nostrils, to the inside of fur-lined cloaks. The scent of it became tied to warmth, to safety. It sank into memory as something protective, familiar, almost maternal. And when dreams came, they often came in fire's colors, deep orange, smoky gray, flickers of gold. The stories people told the next morning always started with, "I dreamed last night," by the fire, and the fire didn't mind. It never asked to be thanked, it never claimed credit, it simply kept glowing, kept giving, and the humans around it, for the first time in all of their short, uncertain lives, slept like creatures who belonged in the night. Not hidden, not hunted, but held in light, in warmth, in the breathing hush of something older than fear. Because with fire, the night wasn't something to endure anymore, it was something to rest inside. When shadows moved because of us. At first they didn't understand it. The way the shadows danced, how they stretched along the cave walls, stretched long and strange across stone, curled beneath arms, under eyes, behind the curve of a child's neck. Before fire, shadows belonged to the sun, to the moon, to trees that swayed and clouds that passed. Shadows were things cast onto the world, not shaped by it. But now the shadows responded to them. One log added to the fire, and the wall across the shelter came alive. Fingers flickered on rock, hair waved in silence. Movement, slow and echoed. It was as if the world was watching back. Some thought the shadows were spirits. Others thought they were part of themselves. Pieces made visible only by flame. What they knew for sure was that the fire had changed the balance, because now they could make light. and with light came the power to move darkness. It was subtle at first. A hand lifted in front of the fire would cast a large silhouette on the wall, a wave would ripple like water. A child stepping in front of the coals would turn the whole cave into a theater of giants. They laughed at first, and then they stared. It didn't feel like a game for long. It felt like a discovery. They could make the shadows move, not just be shaped by them. In a world where so much was beyond their control, the weather, the animals, the hunger, this was something different, something new. The flicker of firelight had given them dominion over something untouchable, even if only for a moment, even if only inside the circle of stones. At night, when the wind howled outside and the fire was steady, someone would lean forward and begin a silent show. Fingers mimicking horns, birds, a stalking cat. Another would follow with their own additions, and before long, the wall told a story made of light and absence, a language without words, a kind of communication older than speech itself. Sometimes they told stories of hunts gone wrong, sometimes of ancestors, sometimes of animals who spoke, and always, the shadows moved to match. It taught them rhythm, gesture, performance, the shape of meaning before the sound of it. Children copied it. Elders used it to teach. They didn't know it yet, but they were laying the foundation for myth, for drama, for the kind of truth that needs movement to be understood. And behind all of it, the fire kept burning, kept throwing shadows across the stone, kept showing them that darkness was not a void. It was a canvas, when shadows moved because of them. Something changed inside. They weren't just in the world anymore. They were part of how it moved. They were no longer just creatures of habit and hunger. They were makers, makers of light, makers of meaning. And in the hush of night, while others slept, someone would sit awake just a little longer, watching the shadows twist and roll, their own hands raised, letting the wall tell a story that no words could carry, a story made entirely of fire and the new quiet power of will. The quiet that came after wood first burned. It was louder than they expected, the first time they heard it. The fire, not the soft, steady coals they would come to love later, but the first real burning of dry wood. It cracked, it snapped, it roared, it hissed as sap turned to steam and bark peeled away in blistering curls. It frightened them. This wasn't a gentle thing. This was hunger made visible. They sat back at first, eyes wide, unsure whether to trust it. The flames leapt and clawed and cast shadows across every surface. And then, suddenly, it didn't. After the first burst, the fire settled. The wood gave in, and in that giving, something remarkable happened. There was quiet, not the silence of fear, or absence, or isolation, but a new kind of quiet, a listening quiet, a warmth-soaked, ember-held, breath-between moments kind of quiet. It wasn't total stillness. You could still hear the faint pop of a coal breaking, the low hum of wind beyond the shelter wall, someone shifting beneath their hide. But something had changed. The fire had spoken, and now it listened. No one filled the space with words. They didn't know what to say yet. This kind of quiet didn't ask for stories. It asked for stillness, for noticing. The heat had wrapped around them slowly, like steam rising off sun-warmed stone. The flames, once wild, had curled into themselves, becoming lower, thicker, steadier. The smoke thinned, the shadows calmed. And in that moment, with skin warm, breath slow, and bodies finally able to stop moving, they experienced something they hadn't known before. Peace, not safety exactly. The world was still dangerous, and sleep would still come with risk. But this moment, this sliver of time after the wood surrendered to the flame, it felt different. It felt held. Children stopped fidgeting. Elders blinked less often. The space between heartbeats felt longer somehow. There was no urgency to fill the air with anything else. Even the animals outside seemed to pause. Even the wind lowered its voice. They would come to know this part of the fire, this quiet, as sacred. Later, they would build routines around it. They'd learn which wood burned cleaner, which bark held more crackle than heat, which pieces to place on the outside edge so the core would hold longer. But all of that came after. The first time, they just sat with it. Let it be. One figure reached out, slowly, palm hovering just above the flame's reach. Not to feed it, not to poke it, just to feel, to understand what it meant to be warmed by something outside of the body. That too was new. Heat had always come from the sun, from exertion, from one another. But this warmth was chosen, built, held. They had made it. The fire didn't speak in words, but it offered answers. It answered cold with comfort, hunger with hope, and chaos, the kind that ruled the wild, with rhythm. And it was in this quiet, with wood turned to amber coal, and no one daring to speak first, that something older than language stirred, a kind of presence, a feeling that this was the beginning of something permanent, not just heat, but time, but memory, but home. The fire, now low, glowed, like thought itself, and in that glow, people began to truly sit together, not just near each other, but with one another, present, open, human. That's what fire gave them, not just safety from the dark, or warmth from the cold. It gave them the stillness they didn't know they needed, and in that stillness, they became something new. What fire gave that tools never could? They had tools long before fire, stones chipped into blades, antlers sharpened into hooks, bones ground into awls and piercers, hands grew calloused from carving, arms strong from hammering. The world was chipped and scraped and broken into shape. Tools gave reach, they gave leverage, they gave survival, but they never gave comfort. Tools changed the body's chances. Fire changed the body's experience. A tool could cut meat, but fire made that meat tender. A tool could tear bark. Fire turned that bark into smoke that chased the insects away. A tool could dig a hole. Fire turned that hole into something warm, something that held light. Tools extended the hand. Fire changed the mind. A spear could protect you from a beast, but fire made the beast keep its distance. Tools made you dangerous. Fire made you respected, maybe even feared. Predators that had once stalked the dark kept their distance now, not because of the people, but because of what glowed beside them, what flickered, what hissed. No tool ever taught you patience. Fire did. It had to be coaxed, fed just right, smothered gently. Tools could be dropped, picked up again. Fire had to be watched, learned, understood, and in that learning came something rare, attention, presence, the kind that lingered long after the task was done. Tools built shelter. Fire made it a home. Inside that home, around that glow, the first stories were told, not shouted over wind, or shouted across hunt, but whispered, wondered aloud. Questions too big for stone to answer. Where did we come from? What are the stars? Why do we remember dreams? You could cut with a blade, but you couldn't warm your child with it. You couldn't keep a circle of bodies alive with it. Tools could save, but they couldn't soothe. Fire soothed. It wrapped around the ankles after a long day of walking. It softened roots too bitter to eat raw. It turned marrow into meals. It made nights possible. It gave eyes something to rest on, and voices something to gather around. Tools required strength. Fire required care, and care changed everything. Because care became ritual, ritual became meaning, and meaning became memory. You didn't just use fire, you kept it, guarded it, named the ones who knew how to carry it safely. You wrapped embers in ash and carried them across rivers. You waited at dawn for the coal to breathe again. You mourned when it died, and you celebrated when it caught. No one ever cried when a stone cracked, but when fire went out, truly out, it was grief. Cold came quick, the world grew larger, harder, more uncertain. And then, fire would return, from flint, from friction, from a neighbor who had kept it safe, and the silence would lift. Fire didn't make you stronger, it made you softer, which in the world before walls might have been the most powerful thing of all, because tools conquered. Fire connected. Why the hunt didn't end at the kill. The moment the animal fell, it might have seemed like the end. The throw had been true, the stone point buried where it needed to. The body collapsed, breath slowed, then stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, a silence that used to mean victory. But the ones who survived long enough, the ones who remembered enough winters and too many hungry seasons, they knew that was only the beginning. The hunt didn't end at the kill. It only changed shape, because now came the work. The real work. The long work. The quiet part of the hunt. First, you looked around. Not for celebration, but for danger. Blood called other hunters. Scents carried far. And in a world without fences, without safe places, without certainty, you couldn't assume you'd carry your prize home without contest. Then came the ritual. You knelt. You touched the animal. Sometimes you whispered. Sometimes you thanked it. No one had words for what they felt in that moment. Not really, but everyone felt something. Reverence, relief, a solemn kind of grace. You hadn't just won. You'd been given something. And that meant something too. The carcass had to be opened carefully. The first cut mattered. Some waited for the elder to do it. Others learned by watching, then doing. The warmth that poured out reminded everyone just how alive the animal had been only moments ago. That warmth faded fast, so you moved faster. Meat had to be divided quickly, not just for sharing, for carrying, for cooking, for hiding. Muscles needed separating. Fat needed saving. Organs, if still fresh, were consumed on the spot. Rich in what the body lacked, nothing was wasted. Skin was peeled, not torn. Bones were checked for tool-making potential. Even the hooves and sinew had purpose. Then came the hardest part, the carrying. Miles, sometimes, uphill, through brush and wet ground, over snow, through fear, always watching, always alert. The kill was heavy in more ways than one. The hunters didn't speak much on the way back. Words felt too loud. They knew better than to call attention to the weight on their backs. Predators could follow. Even other people, hungry ones, might wait for the return trail. But fire was waiting, and that changed everything. Because fire meant preservation. Meat could be smoked, roasted, cooked, until it kept for longer. No more racing against rot. Fire extended the life of the kill, extended the meaning of it. And around the fire, the second half of the hunt began. The telling, that was part of the work too. The one who threw the spear might stay quiet at first, but others would speak for them. The arc of the weapon, the way the animal turned, the choice of timing, the close call, the clever flanking, the moment it fell. These weren't just details, they were lessons, they were pride, they were proof that the group could still survive. Children listened wide-eyed, elders nodded. Everyone ate, slowly at first, then gratefully. Meat wasn't just food, it was memory, it was warmth in the belly, when cold scraped at the door, it was energy for the next day. It was proof that risk brought reward, if taken wisely, and long after the bones were scraped, they were used, sharpened into needles, fashioned into hooks, hung as ornaments, buried with the dead. Every part had meaning. The hunt echoed on. Even the ashes held the memory of the kill. Smoke carried its story upward, the grease in the flame, the scent in the air. It lingered, reminded everyone. We earned this. The next day, the next week, the story changed slightly, grew longer, became myth, but the truth stayed rooted in the same soil. The kill was never the end. It was only the opening note in a song of survival. A song sung by firelight, passed from breath to breath, and the ones who truly knew what it meant to hunt, they never saw it as bloodlust, or glory, or dominance. They saw it for what it was, a responsibility, a transformation, a sacred thread from life into life. And when they closed their eyes to sleep, full and warm, they didn't dream of the throw or the fall, they dreamed of what came after. The circle, the fire, the knowing, and the quiet that followed, when the world, for just a little while, felt like it was enough. The way fire turned meat into time. At first, meat was a race against the air, against the flies, against the heat of the day or the deep chill of night. Once the animal fell, the clock began ticking, and not a gentle one. It was a countdown. The nose could smell before the eyes saw anything. The flesh softened, darkened, twisted. Rot was not patient. Time was not kind. Before fire, they had only a brief window. Cut, eat, share, or lose it all. But when fire came, time changed its shape. Suddenly, the meat didn't have to disappear before the sun did. Suddenly, it could wait. It could be stored, hung, smoked, dried, turned from fleeting necessity into a resource, into security, into a plan. Fire turned meat into time. It wasn't just about taste, though taste changed too. The first time someone held meat over flame and watched it brown, they didn't have a word for flavor, but they knew it felt better in the mouth. Softer, safer. They didn't know about bacteria or parasites, but they knew what sickness looked like, and cooked meat made people sick less often. That was all the evidence they needed. But the real magic was what came after. With meat that lasted, you didn't have to move the next morning. You didn't have to hunt again immediately. You could stay, sit, mend a tool, watch the sky, tell a story twice instead of once, let a wound heal, let a child grow stronger, let the body rest. Fire didn't just cook the meat, it cooked space into their lives. It made room for breath. It made planning possible, not just reacting to the next hunger, but preparing for it. Some of the meat would be eaten right away, while the fat was still dripping, while the skin crackled. But some would be tied with fibers, hung over slow coals, turned gently in smoke. Time infused into it. Preservation became ritual. They began to build racks, dig shallow pits, cover strips with leaves to keep flies away. They learned that some woods flavored the meat, made it sweeter, heartier, denser. Some added too much smoke, some burned too fast. Knowledge took shape. Memory attached to flavor. A taste reminded you of a season. A texture brought back the face of the one who'd first taught you how long to hold it over the fire before it stiffened. And then, when winter came, and the ground was hard, and the trees bare, and the animals scarce, they reached for those smoked strips, and ate time. That meat wasn't just nourishment. It was summer, saved. It was motion, paused. It was the echo of a successful hunt made edible, long after the moment had passed. Fire turned something that spoiled into something that stayed, something that vanished in hours into something that lingered for weeks. In that gift, fire did something tools never could. It let people imagine the future, not just the next day, but a week ahead, a season, even more. The ones who lived through many winters knew every strip of dried meat was a decision already made, a hunger already answered. It changed their minds, not just their diets. Because when you don't have to fear the immediate, your thoughts move forward, they grow roots, they stretch like shadows in the firelight. You plan, you speak of tomorrow. You teach your children what meat can be, not just what it is. And with that came new questions. Could the meat be stored in woven baskets? Could smoke be trapped better in deeper shelters? Could bark be used to flavor it? Could plants preserve it further? What began with fire became something bigger. Fire taught them that time wasn't just something they moved through, it was something they could hold, and holding time, through food, through fire, through memory, was the beginning of culture, of choice, of everything that came next. So they sat chewing slowly on what was once fast, once wild, once fleeting, and they felt something ancient rise in them, not just fullness, but freedom. When children learn to feed it before themselves, it didn't begin with rules. Not at first, no one handed a child a scroll or carved a command into stone. The lesson was older than language, older than warning. It was passed not through words, but through glances, through gestures, through watching, always watching, and slowly understanding. Fire had needs. Everyone came to know this. But children, they learned earliest. Not because they understood fire's power, but because they understood its silence. Fire didn't cry out like a child. It didn't beg like a hungry dog. It just faded. It whispered less. It dimmed. It cooled. And then, if forgotten, it died. And so the children began to notice. First it was the simplest things. The gathering of sticks too small for the adults to bother with. The careful drying of leaves under hides, placed just near enough the embers to crisp, but not burn. They learned the difference between damp and dead, between smoke that meant ready, and smoke that meant too late. Somewhere in that daily repetition, that ritual of watching flame and feeding it, they began to place it before themselves. Before food, before warmth, before rest, because they'd seen what happened when it went out. They had heard the stories, not as bedtime tales, but as warnings dressed in memory. Times when no ember survived the storm, when the last spark had been lost to wet moss, when even the elder with flint couldn't bring it back in time. Cold was not just uncomfortable, cold was the long dark. Cold was quiet, panic. Cold meant stillness in limbs that should have been moving, so they rose early, or stayed awake later, crept to the coals before the rest stirred. They held dry twigs in their hands like offerings. They watched the way a tiny breath could coax a glow back into flame. They knew the exact moment when the fire was hungry again, not with urgency, but with need. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't even duty. It was something closer to devotion. They weren't feeding fire instead of themselves, because someone told them to. They did it because fire fed everyone. They had seen the way it changed the shelter, not just in temperature, but in tone. When fire was alive, voices softened, eyes lifted, hands opened. The world felt less heavy. When it dimmed, everything dimmed. So they fed it first. Sometimes that meant skipping the best cut of meat, placing the fatty trimmings into the coals to keep the burn steady. Sometimes it meant giving up the driest bit of wood they'd hidden under their bedroll. Sometimes it meant kneeling barefoot in the frost, hands stiff, just to relight what others had forgotten. But no one scolded them for that kind of giving, because even the oldest among them remembered what it meant to have lost the flame once. In time, children learned what kinds of fuel lasted through the night, what wood smoked too much, which moss caught best. They watched how adults leaned in close, not just to warm themselves, but to judge the mood of the flame, because fire had moods, and the children began to read them like they read weather, or faces, or the tilt of the moon. Before long, feeding the fire became a kind of language, a way of speaking without words. A hand offered a stick. A sibling nodded. A friend adjusted the pile, shielding it from wind. A group sat a little closer, all of it done in silence, in rhythm, in mutual knowing. And slowly, without ceremony, those children became the next keepers, the next watchers, the next ones who would one day show another small hand how to place kindling just right. In that way, the memory of fire, and the memory of care, passed forward, and with it something even deeper, the first understanding of community. To place the flame before yourself wasn't selflessness for its own sake. It was trust in the whole, that the fire would warm everyone, that you were not alone. That survival wasn't just your own heartbeat, but the shared breath of many, so they fed it first, and in doing so they fed everything that made them human. How fire made us stay in one place longer. Before fire, the world was walked. The rhythm of life moved with the herds, the seasons, the rains. People didn't settle, they followed. Food didn't wait, and neither could they. They crossed plains, climbed ridges, traced rivers, and slept beneath whatever shelter the landscape happened to offer that night. But then came fire, and slowly, things began to shift. Not all at once, not with some grand decision, just a pause, a delay, a second thought before packing everything again. Because for the first time, something didn't want to be moved. Flames were delicate, coals needed watching. A fire couldn't be wrapped in a bundle and thrown over the shoulder. Sure, embers could be carried, buried in ash, kept breathing inside special bark pouches, but it was a risk. Everyone knew it. One gust of wind, one slip in the river, one night too wet, and it would be gone. So the idea formed, slow as smoke curling upward. What if we stayed just a little longer? What if the fire stayed here, and we stayed with it? Suddenly, that little hollow near the river felt worth staying for. The one with dry wood within reach, with flat stones, with trees to break the wind. The cave with a ceiling high enough to trap warmth, but not lose it. The overhang that didn't leak, the dirt that didn't flood. They began stacking stones around the edges of the fire, learning how to cradle heat, how to make it last. They cleared space just for the flames. A place that was for the fire, not just beside it. It became something like a hearth, long before that word was born. And when you had a hearth, it made sense to have a seat. And if you had a seat, maybe a wall, or a mat, or a woven screen to keep the wind out. And suddenly, the fire wasn't outside, it was inside, and you were inside. And the idea of moving felt inconvenient, because for the first time, comfort had a shape, warmth had a location, and the land itself began to mean more than passing usefulness. It began to mean home. With fire, food could be cooked, preserved. That meant hunting less often. It meant staying while the food lasted, which meant resting, which meant healing. It meant someone who was injured didn't need to be left behind. They could be cared for. A child didn't have to keep pace with the strongest walker. They could stay wrapped near the coals. Elders could speak without being rushed. People could breathe between the urgencies of life. And when people stayed, they noticed. They noticed patterns in the way the sun touched a certain rock. They noticed how long it took bark to grow back, which berries came first, where birds nested, what the clouds meant above a certain ridge. Observation deepened. Memory took root in the land. They began to name things, not just people, places, trees, rocks, corners of the shelter, trails, even the fire itself sometimes, especially if it had lasted a long time. Fires had personalities, tempers, habits. A good fire was worth honoring. Staying meant they could leave marks. Charcoal on stone, bones buried in circles, paths worn smooth, and stories tied to that place, told around that fire. Not just a tale for the night, but for the next time, and the time after that. Fire gave shape to place, and place gave shape to memory. The fire didn't just ask them to stay, it deserved it. After all, it had fed them, warmed them, kept the predators back, helped the child's fever break, softened roots into sweetness. You didn't walk away from that lightly. Sure, they still moved, when they had to, when the food ran out, or the weather changed or danger crept too close. But the moves slowed, the pauses stretched, and with every stay, the roots reached a little deeper. Eventually, they started stacking stones not just around fire, but over it, building shelters that remembered where the warmth had always come from. Later, those shelters would become homes, villages, towns, but it started here, with the decision not to carry the fire, but to stay with it. Fire turned time into something lived together, and land into something remembered, because when the fire stayed, so did the people, and the world, once only a place to pass through, became a place to belong to. The nights we didn't have to run. Before the fire, night was not a time to rest, it was a time to survive. You didn't walk after dark unless you had to, you didn't speak unless it was urgent. The silence wasn't peace, it was tension, a waiting. Every sound from the forest meant something, a rustle too close, a snap too sharp, breathing that wasn't yours. You learned not to trust the dark. Night was when things hunted, and humans, as they were then, were not the top of that list. They had speed, yes, they had tools, some sharp and clever, but they didn't have fur to keep them warm, or fangs to defend themselves. They didn't see well when the stars were hidden, and the wind carried their scent, so they ran, not always fast, but often, sometimes with a baby wrapped against their chest, sometimes dragging a wounded elder between them, sometimes leaving food behind, or tools, or fire that hadn't caught yet. Whatever couldn't be carried was left, because movement meant survival. You stayed in one place only as long as it was safe. You watched the sky, you studied the trees, you listened to the birds, whose songs always changed when danger came, and when the time came, you ran. But then, fire. Fire was not just light, not just heat, it was a signal. To predators, it meant something dangerous lives here. The glow alone pushed the beasts back. The smell of smoke marked the air with human presence, and the crackling, that sound so familiar now, was once a declaration: we are here, and we are not weak. The night didn't change immediately, but slowly, one evening at a time, the urgency began to ease. They began to sit longer, to stretch their legs beside the flame, to whisper softly without fear of being overheard by teeth in the dark. They ate later, they smiled more easily. They didn't run, because the fire made stillness feel safe. There were of course moments when fear returned, when something rustled too close, when a log shifted wrong in the flame, and cast a sudden shadow. The old instincts never left entirely, but instead of leaping to their feet and fleeing into the black, they looked, they waited, and often, nothing came, because the fire was still burning. That changed everything. With each night they stayed, something ancient uncoiled in their spines, muscles stopped bracing, eyes blinked longer. The idea of sleep, real sleep, deep sleep, began to enter their lives, not as a weakness, but as a right, and with that came something even more unexpected. Trust. They slept closer to one another, not in fear, not as a shield wall, but as family. Children curled beside their parents, listening to stories instead of footsteps. The old ones sat beside the flames, and let their memories spill into the dark. Tales were told not to warn of what might come, but to remember what had been survived. And in those nights, those still, glowing, smoky nights, something changed in the way they saw each other. Because in a world where night meant death, choosing not to run was an act of faith, in the fire, in each other, in the idea that maybe this time, they could stay, and not just survive, but rest. The younger ones stopped asking when they would move again. The middle-aged ones began to build things that weren't meant to be carried. The elders, once always preparing the group for departure, sat down for longer than they ever had before. The fire made all that possible. It carved out a space in time where fear didn't lead the conversation, where danger wasn't always knocking, where warmth wasn't temporary. They began to hear new sounds at night, not just danger or alarm, but laughter, quiet humming, the way a stick crackles when it breaks in just the right way. They began to listen to the rhythm of the fire, like it was an old friend, one who kept watch so they didn't have to. And somewhere between those flickering shadows and the soft breathing of others around them, they learned the most human lesson of all, that safety is not the absence of danger, it's the presence of something stronger, something held, something shared, something burning softly at the center of the circle. A reminder that, just for now, they did not have to run, and for the first time in history, that was enough. Why our faces changed around the fire. It wasn't just what the fire did to the world around us, it was what it did to us. to the shape of our evenings, to the tone of our thoughts, to the way we sat and breathed and listened. But more than anything, it changed our faces. Not in some magical or symbolic way, though there was magic in it. No, this was quieter, deeper, a change so slow you wouldn't see it happen in a single lifetime. But looking back, tracing the shadows and embers through generations, it becomes clearer. Fire changed where we spent our nights. Instead of hiding in trees or lying curled up alone, we gathered closer, face to face. And in that closeness, expressions mattered. A twitch of the brow, the squint of an eye, the rise of a corner of the mouth. All of it meant something. All of it needed to be seen. Before fire, our ancestors didn't spend much time watching each other in the dark. There was no need. Night was for silence, for motion, for sleeping in fear or running from it. But fire created time. It gave space for conversation. Not the loud, urgent kind, but the soft kind. The kind where voices lower and hands rest, where you don't speak to survive. You speak to connect. And the face lit from below, dancing in flame, became a canvas for that connection. Imagine the first humans staring at one another across a small flame. They'd never noticed that a furrowed brow meant confusion, or that a half smile meant safety. But now they had time. Now they had light. And with it came understanding. We began to evolve for that light. Eyebrows became more expressive, lips more mobile. Eyes adapted to catch the flicker and depth of emotion in low glow. Even the shape of our skulls shifted slowly, allowing for a richer range of motion in the face. More nuance, more signal. Because around the fire, stories were told, and stories need more than words. They need the lift of the chin at just the right moment, the pause before a wide-eyed stare, the subtle smirk after the tale's turn. Fire made storytelling possible, and storytelling made facial expression necessary. In that way, fire shaped language long before it shaped cities. And more than that, it changed how we felt, because something happens to the body when it's near fire. Shoulders relax, the breath slows, the sharp edge of awareness softens. We begin to mirror those around us, not just in posture, but in face. A yawn passes through the group like a wave. A single chuckle becomes shared laughter. Sadness pools in the eyes of many, just from the sight of one. Around fire, we learned empathy, and empathy changed us. The lines in our foreheads deepened. From worry and care and curiosity, the muscles around our eyes strengthened. From smiling, from squinting at stories, from holding back tears, cheeks softened, brows lowered in understanding. The tilt of the head became as meaningful as the words themselves. Fire made it possible to see one another, really see. Not just the outline of a figure in the dark, but the whole landscape of emotion on a person's face. And that recognition, that mutual reading, it built something no other species had. It built connection. Fire turned survival into society. It made moments linger. It made eye contact matter. It let us share warmth not just through heat, but through presence. And presence is what reshaped our faces. Even now when we gather around campfires, or sit with a candle in a quiet room, our faces change again. The modern world fades a little. The old muscles return. The eyelids soften. The mouth relaxes. We lean in, not out. Because somewhere, deep in our memory, the fire still lives, and it still asks the same thing it asked 100,000 years ago. Sit down, face one another, be human, not alone, but together, and in that light, let your face say what words never quite could. The glow that let eyes meet in silence. Before language, before carved bone or drawn symbols, before even the first names passed from elder to child, there was the glance, there was the quiet recognition between one person and another. The shared breath, the moment when two people, without sound, simply understood. But in the dark, that kind of knowing was difficult. You couldn't see the lines in someone's face, couldn't tell if their mouth was drawn with fear or just sleep, couldn't tell if their eyes were warning you or watching the same stars. Silence was there, yes, but it wasn't always comforting. It was fire that gave silence meaning, because silence without light is isolation, but silence with light, that's presence. That's why the glow mattered, not the wild flame, not the roaring heat of greenwood burning too fast, but the steady, low-lit glow, the kind of fire that hummed instead of shouted, the kind that knew how to last through the night. That kind of fire let your eyes meet someone else's, and hold there, not to speak, not to question, but simply to see. it didn't have to mean anything grand. Sometimes it was just a glance that said, "I know," or "You're still awake too," or "It's going to be all right." The kind of glance that could cross generations, from grandparent to grandchild, from hunter to watcher, from storyteller to listener, and land softly, without sound. Fire made that possible. Its light wasn't like the sun. It didn't demand. It invited. It didn't expose all things. It revealed just enough to see the tremble in a hand, the shimmer in a tear, the slight shake of a nod, the almost smile that would have gone unnoticed if not caught in just the right flicker of light. In that way, fire didn't just change what we could see, it changed how we felt about being seen. Because in the world before fire, being seen could mean danger. Being seen meant a predator had caught your scent. Being seen meant being watched by something that wanted to devour, not understand. But now, around this glow, to be seen was safety. To be seen was being part of the circle. And in that shared circle, sometimes nothing needed to be said at all. The mother, holding her child against her chest, would look across the embers to the one keeping watch, and with a single glance, she knew he hadn't slept, but he was strong. She could close her eyes. Two friends, quiet after a long day's search for roots and water, would meet eyes across the fire, and without words, they'd remember the shared struggle, the nearly lost trail, the saved meal. The moment passed between them with no need for voice. The old one, too tired to tell stories now, would simply rest their eyes on the flame, and someone younger would catch that look. A nod would pass from one to the other. The story would wait for tomorrow. The story would still be there. And sometimes silence was what was needed most. Not because there were no words, but because the words could never hold what the silence already knew. The fire, that soft breathing center of the night, held all those moments, and the glow it gave, dim and warm, and flickering like memory itself, was the thread that connected them. There were no masks in firelight. The darkness beyond might still hold danger, but inside the circle, within the reach of the glow, you were allowed to be whole, unhidden, human. Even today, we feel it. When we sit beside a campfire and don't speak, when we light a candle and feel our shoulders drop, when a room goes quiet, not because we're out of things to say, but because saying more would be less than what's already shared in stillness. That's the inheritance of fire. Not just warmth, not just survival, but the chance to meet eyes with someone you trust, and say everything that needs to be said without saying anything at all. What we burned, just to stay together. It wasn't just wood. That's the first thing you learn when you look closely. When you trace the story not from the smoke going up, but from what went in. What we burned, to keep fire alive, wasn't always neat, dry kindling. It wasn't always fuel we could spare. And it wasn't always a choice. Sometimes it was bark, peeled from the inside of the only tree near the camp, knowing it would weaken and might not stand another storm. Sometimes it was roots dug too soon, never given a chance to grow again. Sometimes it was the edge of a tool, not the whole thing, just the handle shaved down, bit by bit, until it was too short to use. But sometimes it was more. There were nights when the wind howled so loud that even the fire began to flicker like it doubted itself. Nights when the stars stayed hidden behind clouds so thick the world felt smaller, colder. Nights when the river froze faster than it should have, and someone whispered that maybe this winter was the one that wouldn't end. And on those nights, if the flame started to fade, people made decisions. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones. Someone would reach for a woven mat, once used for sleeping, and tear it down the middle. Someone else would untie the pouch of dried grass, meant for tomorrow's kindling, and pour it into the coals instead. They would burn baskets, bindings, carved bowls. They would burn a part of what made life easier. Not because they could afford to, but because keeping warm together was more important than keeping comfort for later. And then there were the harder things. The old cradle that once held a child now grown. The bit of hide sewn by a mother who hadn't made it through the last season. The carved wooden idol passed from one winter to the next, its face worn smooth from the touch of praying fingers. When the cold came hard enough, long enough, those things too fed the fire. Because survival wasn't just about heat, it was about staying in a circle, staying close. It was about one person saying, "Take this," and someone else not arguing. It was about believing that there would be time later to carve another bowl, to stitch another mat, to honor the memory in a new way, but only if they all made it through the night. So they burned what they had, and in doing so they built something larger than the fire itself. They built a kind of promise that no one would be left out in the cold, that no one would sit beside the dark while the rest huddled in light. If the fire was to live, it would live for everyone. That kind of thinking changed them, not just practically, not just in how they packed or prepared or traveled, but deeply, in how they thought about value, what they were willing to give, what they were willing to lose, and why. It taught them that things were only precious until someone needed them more than you did, that objects meant less than people, that warmth meant nothing if it wasn't shared, and that sometimes the greatest act of love wasn't holding on, it was offering what you thought you never could let go of. Even now, long after stone tools have turned to metal and bone needles to thread, the lesson stays. You feel it when you give up your seat so someone else can be near the fire, when you hand over your coat without asking for it back, when you stay up just a little later so the one beside you can sleep without fear. Because deep in us, somewhere beneath the surface, we remember. We remember what we burned, and why, not for ourselves, but to make sure no one had to face the cold alone. That was what the fire meant, that was what it cost, and that was what made it sacred. The first time fire wasn't shared, no one remembered exactly when it happened, only that it had never happened before. Not in living memory, not in the stories passed down, not around that fire. Because fire had always meant together. It had always meant there was room, space to sit, space to warm your fingers, space to speak if you had a voice left, or listen if you didn't. But then came the first moment, when the fire wasn't shared. It didn't begin with cruelty. That's what makes it harder to understand. Even now, it began with fear. The night was colder than usual, not colder in degrees, but in silence. The kind of cold that sat heavy in the ribs, and made breath sound brittle. The kind that came with sky so clear it hurt to look up. Everyone knew what it meant. The kind of night where one fire wasn't enough, but no one dared ask for more. There had been whispers earlier, tension in the day. Someone had returned late from a failed forage. Tempers had flared, quiet and sharp, like flint striking stone. Resources were low, spirits were lower, and still the fire was lit, small, trembling, but alive. But not everyone was invited to sit near it. At first it was subtle. A slight turn of the shoulder, a shift in the circle that didn't leave enough space, a moment where someone reached for warmth and found only backs. The others looked away, not in malice, but in guilt, in tiredness, in the quiet, terrible belief that maybe this was what needed to happen, that maybe just tonight, the circle had to shrink to survive. The one left out didn't speak. He just crouched on the edges, arms around knees, eyes locked on the flame. It was close enough to see, but not to feel, close enough to remember what warmth used to feel like, and those around the fire tried not to look, because the truth was, they felt the shame, they felt the betrayal. Fire wasn't owned, that was the oldest rule. You didn't light a flame and keep it to yourself, you didn't draw lines around heat. Fire had been the one thing that made the difference between humans and everything else, the difference between night and safety, between death and survival, and now someone was on the outside of it. Something broke that night. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even seen by everyone, but it was felt, and the next day, no one talked about it. They moved as if the moment hadn't happened. They gathered wood together. They boiled roots. They watched the sky for signs of the next freeze. But the circle never quite felt the same again, because now everyone knew fire could be withheld, and once you've seen warmth turned into territory, it's hard to unsee it. That night echoed forward, not just in memory, but in pattern. Over seasons, people began to remember that fire could be shared, or not, that it could mark us and them, that it could be a symbol not just of unity, but of power. And so, for the first time, fires were built apart, not for warmth, but for distance, for division, for control. Some fires stayed open, welcoming. Others became guarded, placed behind sticks or stones, tended only by those who believed they had the right. And the more that happened, the more fire lost something essential, not its heat, not its light, but its trust. Yet there were those who remembered, who saw the danger in this new way of thinking, who whispered around their flames, no one should sit in the cold, who told children stories about the night the fire wasn't shared, not as a lesson in history, but as a warning for tomorrow, because fire might live in the wood, but it only meant something in the way it was passed. And when that passing stopped, even briefly, the cold crept in, not just around the feet or fingers, but into the heart. That's the night fire became a mirror. It showed us not only who we were, but what we might become. Why some forgot how to start it. It's easy to assume that fire, once discovered, was never lost again, that once a single flame had been coaxed from spark and breath, it would stay with us, passed on like a torch, generation to generation, without fail. But that wasn't how it happened. There were times when people forgot, not all at once, not everywhere, but in pockets of the world, in valleys where the winters were long and the kindling always damp, in deserts where the sun baked everything. To silence and flint was harder to find than food, in islands too wet, or forests too afraid to speak. The memory of how to begin slipped away. It didn't vanish in drama, it faded, and it began with trust. For a long time there had always been someone who knew, the firekeeper, the old one, the one with the hands that could coax life from dry grass and stone. Everyone else depended on them, not out of laziness, but out of rhythm. You hunted, she sparked the flames. You built the shelter, he kept the coals breathing through the night. It worked, until it didn't. Until the firekeeper was sick, or gone, or too far behind. Until the group was separated by flood or fight. Until the bundle of coals meant to survive the journey crumbled into cold ash. Until someone realized for the first time in their short life that they didn't know how to start a fire. They had watched it happen so many times. Flint and steel, bow drill and spindle, dry moss and bark dust. But watching and doing are not the same. Not when the wind is biting and the sun is already falling and the children are asking if the cold is coming. Some tried, fingers numb, breath short, hands blistered from effort. They scraped rock until it sang and bled and sparked, but not enough. They spun sticks between palms until the wood smoked, but the ember never came. And with each failure, they said the same thing. I should have learned, and the others just nodded. Because fire was never just about the heat. It was about the knowledge, the ritual, the right moment, the right rhythm, the right patience. Fire did not come for panic. It came for stillness, for precision, for respect. It was in its own way a test, not of strength, but of memory, and when the memory failed, the price was immediate. There are stories, told quietly, about those who walked for miles just to borrow flame. Whole families traveling days to find smoke on the horizon, not to beg for food or shelter, but simply for fire. For a beginning, they would arrive, tired and shivering, and the ones who held the flame would decide. Sometimes they shared, sometimes they didn't, and each time it happened, the lesson grew sharper. If we don't teach it, we lose it. If we don't share it, it fades. If we don't practice it, we forget, even the sacred. Some groups changed after that. They made rules. Every child had to start a fire before they could carry one. No group would leave a place unless at least 3 people could light a flame with nothing but the land. They turned it into a story, a song, a rite of passage, not because it was easy, but because it was needed. Still, others didn't. Other groups grew used to the ease of embers always being carried, of fire never going out, of the illusion that something, once gained, could never be lost. They wrapped coals in moss, they carried flame in shell bowls, slung from shoulder straps. They built their entire rhythm around keeping it alive, instead of learning to revive it. Until once again, something failed. A river crossing that soaked the pouch, a storm that scattered everything. A night when sleep came too fast, and the fire too low, and then silence. Darkness, cold and the waiting. The long waiting for someone who remembered. Fire was never just about light. It was about the threads that bound memory to muscle. About hands that had learned by doing, not just seeing. About what happens when a skill becomes myth, and a myth becomes loss. And so, in the quiet places of the world, there are still stories whispered by firelight, about the time we forgot. Not to shame, not to frighten, but to remind, because what we forget, the cold remembers, and what we let slip away, becomes something we must earn all over again. The smell that meant home. Before the word home existed, before doors, before walls, before names carved into wooden beams or etched in stone, there was another way to know you belonged somewhere, a way that didn't rely on sight, or even sound. It was in the air, in the thin tendrils of smoke that curled above a ridge, in the scent that clung to skin and hair, in the warmth that drifted on the breeze before you even saw the flames. It was the smell of fire, not just any fire, but your fire, the one your group kept, the one that crackled in a familiar rhythm, that smoked in a way that settled into your memory, into your blood. It wasn't clean or sweet. It wasn't pleasant in the way flowers are. It was sharp, earthy, layered, The scent of ash and singed moss, of cooked root and animal fat, of old wood and dried dung and hide, of time itself burned down slowly into belonging. That smell, that's what told you you'd made it. You could be gone for days, hunting in unfamiliar hills, walking trails with no markers but stones and stars. You could be soaked through, bone-tired, unsure if you'd taken the right path back. But then, somewhere ahead, drifting low and quiet through the trees, it would come, the smell of home, and instantly, your shoulders would drop, your breath would slow, because no matter how lost the trail felt, your nose had found what your eyes couldn't, and in that moment, you knew someone had kept the fire alive. Someone was waiting. The children knew it too, long before they knew the word safe. They knew the scent of sleep, of bodies warmed by fire, of fur rubbed against soot-black stone, of boiled tubers steaming against hollowed bark bowls. They would run toward it before they even saw the flame, laughing sometimes, or quiet, or humming the songs their mothers hummed while stirring. The fire, and its smell, was a map, not to a place, but to a feeling, because that smell wasn't just about heat, it was layered with story. It told you who had cooked that day, what they'd made, whether the hunt had been good, whether someone had burned the stew again, whether they'd used old oak or fresh pine. You could tell from the smoke how high the flames had risen, whether someone had tended it carefully or let it go wild, and more than that, you could tell if something was wrong, if the fire smelled wrong, if the smoke was too bitter or too thin, if it didn't rise the way it usually did. It meant something had changed, that the group had moved on, or that something had gone wrong, maybe a storm, maybe worse. That smell too became part of your instincts, a kind of knowing beneath knowing. It wasn't just about fire, it was about connection. When strangers came, you knew them first by scent, whether they carried the smell of their own fire, or none at all, whether their smoke was foreign, whether they had been without flame too long. The smell of another fire told you more than their voice ever could, and when someone died, their scent lingered in their sleeping place, in their hide bundle, in the stones around where they sat. But slowly, as the fire was moved, as others took their place in the circle, that smell faded, not all at once, but gently, like memory, like breath. And still, long after the group had moved on, long after the last ashes had blown away, an animal passing through might pause, nostrils flaring, sensing something strange, something human, in the bones of the smoke. Long after the fire, its scent remained, etched into the soil, into the bark of nearby trees, into the folds of garments carried to the next place. We carried that smell with us. It clung to our skin, to our hair, to the woven pouches on our backs, to the inside of our mouths, and the folds behind our ears. And even now, in a world of closed windows and filtered air and cleaner fires, sometimes you catch it. The faintest whiff of wood smoke in your sweater, or on someone's jacket in winter, and it stirs something. Not memory, exactly. Something older, something deeper. A reminder of the time when you didn't need to see your people to find them. You just had to breathe and follow the smell that meant home. What fire knew about fear? Fire never needed eyes to see what scared us. It didn't need ears to hear the things we never said. And yet, somehow, it always seemed to know. It danced differently when we were afraid. It leaned toward us like it could feel the tension in our breath. It hissed when we flinched. It flared when we stepped too far away, as if calling us back. There was something ancient in its flicker, something that seemed to understand what hunted us, even when we tried to pretend nothing was there. Fear in the old world didn't look like it does now. It wasn't abstract. It had claws, it had teeth, it waited in the dark spaces between the trees. It circled the camp at night. It watched from just beyond the reach of the flame. You couldn't see it clearly, but you could feel its shape, in the way the hair stood up on your arms, in the way the forest fell suddenly silent, in the way even the dogs stopped barking. And in those moments when the fear was thickest, the fire was everything. People didn't speak much in that kind of fear. They didn't move. They didn't even breathe too loud. They sat closer, tucked their hands between their knees, stared into the orange heart of the flame. The youngest curled beside the oldest. The hunters laid their spears near. No one dared let the wood run low. Every crackle was a barrier, every spark a promise, because fire was the only thing that told the wild, we are not prey tonight. It didn't just protect us physically, it protected us psychologically. It gave shape to the circle, a boundary between inside and outside, between known and unknown, between light and the things that waited beyond it. And it didn't matter how long a group had been together, how many winters they'd survived. Fear still came, especially on nights when the moon was gone, and the air smelled wrong, and someone said they saw movement in the tall grass. And fire always responded. It leaned taller, it popped louder, it sent smoke drifting toward the trees, as if to say, "We see you too." There were stories told in whispers, not around children, not unless the danger was real, of what happened when the fire went out at the wrong moment. When someone misjudged how much fuel was needed, when they fell asleep too fast, when rain came early, when fear met darkness, and there was no flame to stand between them. Some said the fire itself could feel fear, that it remembered, that it grew different when danger was near, more restless, more wild, as if it too had instincts, as if it knew what we'd forgotten. That's why fire rituals developed, not just practical but emotional. People thanked the flame aloud, they fed it carefully, they never turned their backs to it for long, they didn't spit near it, they didn't speak its name in jest, they treated it like a living thing, like an elder, like a witness. Because fire had seen what we were too scared to say, it had watched the shadows move, it had held back the cold when fear made our fingers useless, it had warmed the tears we didn't want anyone to see, and when someone died, especially in fear, especially violently, the fire was often the first to know. It burned hotter, it cracked deep, it threw smoke like morning, and sometimes in the days that followed, the flame refused to behave, as if grief, like fear, was something it also understood. People learned to listen to it, not just watch it, but really listen, because there were nights when fear walked among them, not just outside the camp but inside hearts, inside minds. Fear of hunger, fear of betrayal, fear of losing someone before dawn. And in those moments when the world felt small and sharp and uncertain, fire was the one thing that didn't lie. It didn't promise survival, but it promised presence. It said, "I'm here, I'm burning, I'm with you." And that was sometimes enough. Even now, long after the predators are hidden behind glass and concrete, long after the nights are lit by street lamps and screens, we still feel it. That tiny thread of fear when the lights go out. That instinct to light a candle, to kindle something small and flickering in the dark, not because it's bright enough to save us, but because it makes us feel less alone. That is what fire always knew about fear, that it doesn't need to chase it away completely. It only needs to remind us we're not facing it alone. How the flame helped words take root. We didn't always speak in words, not the way we do now. Long before language had shape, before it was carved into breath, before sound became symbol, before grammar or story or memory had a name. There were murmurs and grunts, hums and gesture, rhythm and silence. But even then, something was beginning to take root, and strangely, it didn't begin in daylight. It began in the dark, and always near the fire, because fire changed more than our warmth. It changed our time. It gave us hours that didn't belong to hunting, or gathering, or walking, or hiding. It made space where there was once only exhaustion. Before fire, darkness meant sleep, or fear. But fire extended the day. It carved out a strange new place, night that was not dangerous, not urgent, just quiet. And in that quiet, people began to speak. Not just in warning, not in commands, not in cries or calls, but in something slower, something closer to wondering, to remembering, to reaching, around the fire. Voices softened. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to run. They just opened, and something happened. Someone said something that hadn't been said before, and someone else understood. Not with a look, not with a hand, but with a sound, carried through smoke and shadow, across the warmth of firelight. That was when words started to matter, because fire made us sit still, and stillness is where language grows. Before the flame, we didn't linger in groups. We moved, we scattered, we hunted, we watched our backs, but with fire we circled, we drew close, we stared into the coals. Our mouths moved because our hands finally could rest, and those first words, whatever they were, found room to echo. Fire didn't teach us what to say, but it gave us where to say it. And that place, that sacred circle, held more than bodies. It held the beginnings of stories. One person describing where they saw the herd, another mimicking the cry of a wounded animal, someone else naming the shape the stars had made last night. No one needed to write it down. The flame remembered, because when someone spoke near the fire, their voice was seen, not just heard, seen. Faces flickered with orange light. Eyes caught meaning even before the sound landed. And when a story was good, The fire seemed to join in, rising at the exciting parts, cracking in the pauses, glowing warmly at the end. Language, like flame, needed tending. You couldn't force it, but if you fed it slowly, carefully, it grew. Children listened first, always, huddled close, wide-eyed, absorbing the rhythm of speech, the shape of ideas. They didn't repeat everything, but what they did repeat, stayed, passed on like embers, a word for the sky, a word for the animal that ran with sharp feet, a word for the man who didn't return. The oldest ones spoke with silences between their words, not out of forgetfulness, but out of reverence. The fire made space for quiet, for breath, for memory. No one interrupted near the fire, not unless it was urgent. There was time to listen, time to think. That's how the roots of language reached deeper, not just through noise, but through respect. Some nights, there was singing, or chanting, or games played with sounds and patterns, and the fire always held it. It cradled the voices, carried them upward, made them echo in the minds of those who listened. Without fire, these early songs would have vanished into wind. With it, they settled, became real. Fire wasn't the source of language, but it was the soil, the space in which language could grow. Because words don't thrive in chaos, they need safety, they need repetition, they need community, and fire brought all three. Even now, when we sit around campfires, even when we don't think of ourselves as storytellers, something in us returns to that original shape. We talk longer, slower, more openly. We laugh softer. We listen more. It isn't just nostalgia, it's memory. Deep memory. The body remembers the circle, the breath remembers the warmth. Language came not just from need, but from fire's invitation. And if you listen closely, even today, you can still hear it. That flickering whisper in the coals, the one that says, "Speak, I'm listening." Why the cold stopped winning. There was a time when cold was king. It ruled without question. It moved freely over the land, carving the shapes of mountains, burying rivers, silencing forests beneath blankets of snow and ice. The cold didn't need permission. It didn't wait. It simply was. It seeped into skin, into bone, into breath. It took what it wanted. A sleeping child, a hunter who wandered too far, a mother who gave up her furs so her baby might have one more night. Cold didn't need an army. It needed only time, and time was always on its side. But then, one day, we struck two stones together, or maybe we twisted a dry stick inside a socketed bone. However it began, it wasn't loud. Fire's first breath was quiet. Maybe no one noticed at first, but the cold did, because something had changed. A spark, a flicker, a refusal. Fire didn't chase the cold away, not at first, but it made a promise that we wouldn't just endure anymore. We would resist, that we wouldn't walk blindly into winter's mouth, that we would learn to shape the world back, slowly, and with failure, and loss, but also with light. It didn't happen all at once. There were still nights when fire went out too early, still storms that drowned flames, still mornings when people didn't wake. But something had shifted. The cold had an opponent, now, small, flickering, breakable, yes, but stubborn. Fire didn't have to win the whole war, it just had to hold the line until morning. We began to change alongside it. Not just our hands, not just our tools, but our choices. We stopped moving every time the season shifted. We built better shelters, thicker walls. We planned, stockpiled, waited. We sang to the fire, talked to it, trusted it. The cold watched, and for the first time in ages, it was made to wait outside. And when we weren't cold all the time, we could think. We could tell stories, we could build memory. We could raise children who weren't shaped only by fear of the frost. The cold still came, of course. It still whispered at the edge of every forest, every cave. It still reminded us who had ruled longest. But the fire was different now. It didn't just burn wood. It burned through time, through history, through death. It became a symbol of refusal, our refusal to give up. And that is why the cold stopped winning, because it never expected us to answer back. But we did, and the answer was flame. The first time a fire was protected like a child. It might have started with a single ember, carried carefully from one camp to the next, nestled in a pouch of bark and moss, fanned gently every few minutes to make sure it didn't die. Not yet. Not before it reached the next place. Not before it could become flame again. That ember wasn't just warmth, it was survival, memory, a piece of yesterday needed for tomorrow. And that's when something shifted. Someone looked at that ember, and didn't see fuel. They saw something alive, something that needed care, something that couldn't survive on its own. And so for the first time, fire wasn't just something we used, it was something we protected, like a child. Not metaphorically, literally. The one carrying it didn't take risks, didn't stray too far, didn't walk into the wind without shielding it with their own body. They watched it constantly, checking for color, for smoke, for heat. They whispered to it without realizing, not in words, but in breath and movement. And when someone else came close, they didn't just hand it over, they explained. They taught how to hold it, how to feed it, how not to scare it, because it could be lost in a single careless moment. And losing a fire wasn't like dropping a tool or forgetting a path. Losing the fire could mean the end of the group. No warmth, no cooking, no light, no protection. The difference between holding on and giving in. They'd learned that the hard way, on long journeys, in storms, in frozen valleys. You didn't just have fire, you guarded it. So they began to assign the task, carefully, intentionally. Someone was always the fire bearer. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't low work. It was sacred, an honor. A responsibility on par with the hunter or healer. You were trusted with the future. The youngest would watch the fire bearer closely, absorbing everything, not because they were told to, but because children instinctively recognized care. They understood the way adults cupped their hands, the way they paused when smoke blew the wrong way. Children saw how quiet everyone grew when the flame danced too low. They felt the tension, the reverence, the fear. They learned early fire was fragile, and eventually they too were taught how to carry it. Not all at once, first with help, then in practice runs, then maybe one day, when the group had to move quickly, or split up, or send someone ahead, a child was given the ember, not because they were expendable, but because they were trusted, because they had watched, because they had waited, because they had already proven they would treat it the same way they'd treat their sibling's breath, or their elder's life. Fire, like a child, needed patience, too much air, and it flared wild, dangerous, reckless, too little, and it suffocated, too much fuel too quickly, and it collapsed, too little fuel for too long, and it disappeared. You had to listen to it, feel it, learn its moods, learn when to leave it alone, and when to intervene, just like raising something alive, and in return it grew, it gave, it changed the group forever. There were stories of nights when fire was nearly lost, when the rain came too fast, when the wood turned wet, when the cold pressed in harder than expected, and someone usually small, usually quiet, curled around the fire and kept it alive with their own breath, their own heat. People remembered those stories. They were told again and again, because they weren't just about survival, they were about devotion. Some groups even began treating their first flame, the one lit from a great storm, or passed down from an ancestor, as more than fire. They treated it like family. It had a name, a place, a space of its own, and when it finally died, years or decades later, they mourned, as if they'd lost someone, because in a way they had. They'd lost the thing that once sat at the center of every circle, that had warmed the birth of every child, lit the face of every elder, held the silence of every death. It had witnessed the tribe, quietly, constantly, and in all that time, someone had always been watching it, feeding it, tending it, not out of fear, but out of love, a kind of ancestral love, one that understood the link between light and memory, between flame and breath, because fire wasn't just ours to use, it was ours to raise. When fire taught us to watch the sky, it began with silence. Long after the meat had been cooked, the skins pulled close, the stories told, the fire still burned low, but no one moved to feed it. The heat was enough, the dark was held back. So they looked up, not because they were told to, not because they expected anything, but because something about the fire made them lift their heads. Maybe it was the way the flames danced, flickering upward, always upward, like it knew there was something worth reaching for above. Maybe it was how the smoke curled toward the stars, tracing lines they hadn't seen before. Or maybe it was just that fire gave them stillness, and in stillness, they finally had time to notice what had always been there, the sky. It wasn't new, but it was newly seen. Before fire, night meant blindness. You huddled, you kept your head down, you focused on surviving the cold, the dark, the wind, the sounds in the distance that might not be just wind. But now, with fire, you could look away from the ground, you could lean back, you could let your eyes adjust, and what you saw changed everything. Stars, too many to count, too many to name, but that didn't stop them from trying. They didn't have maps or myths. Not yet, but they had questions, and questions led to patterns. That one star moved. That one didn't. That bright one disappeared last winter, and has now come back. That curve looks like a horn. That cluster like a net. That trail across the sky, like a god's slow breath. They began to mark what they saw, with fingers on cave walls, with stones aligned just so, with notches in wood or bone. The sky had rhythm. The fire had rhythm. It made sense somehow, to treat both with the same reverence, to match the pulse of flame with the slow rotation of constellations, and in time, fire and sky became twins, one below, one above. They reflected each other. When the fire sparked, they imagined a sun being born. When it crackled and hissed, they imagined thunderheads forming far away. When embers rose, they followed their drift, tracing them until they vanished, just like shooting stars. There were nights when the flame seemed to answer the sky, glowing brighter when a moon passed overhead, shrinking when clouds gathered. Around these fires, the first astronomers were born, though they didn't call themselves that. They were watchers, listeners, remembers. Someone always knew when the moon was due to rise late. Someone always knew when the red star would return. They didn't measure time with clocks, but with the shape of light, with the distance between now and the last time a shadow looked like that. Children were taught to watch too, not just the fire, but the heavens. They learned that what burned above mattered just as much as what burned in the circle, that both could guide a journey, that both could tell you when to when to move, when to rest. And as the nights grew longer in winter, the fires grew taller, not just for warmth, but for faith, to call the sun back, to remind it that they were still here, still watching. Some believed the fire was a piece of the sky, a fallen star that hadn't yet forgotten its place. Others said the flames were the language of the sun, a tongue they could speak only in the dark. That's why songs were sung around firelight, not just to entertain, but to speak upward, to let the stars know they'd been seen. Over time, myths grew, some gentle, some terrifying. A god who carried the flame in his belly, a giant who swallowed the sun each night and spit it back out each morning, a bird made of heat and sky, watching over every traveler. And always those stories were told in firelight, passed hand to hand like coals. Fire didn't just give us heat, it gave us perspective. It said, look up, and once we did, we never looked away again. Even now, in cities full of electric glow, in rooms bright with false day, there is something ancient in the act of looking skyward, something quieter, older, like the memory of someone who once sat by a flame, and for the first time, noticed a star move. Fire gave us the sky, not literally, but by giving us the chance to see it, and in return, the sky gave us meaning. Why cooking changed the shape of our bodies? It didn't happen overnight. It never does. But something started changing the moment the first piece of meat sizzled over a flame, when the smoke carried the scent further than any cry could reach, when the skin of roots softened over embers, when the marrow slipped more easily from the bone. That's when bodies began listening. Before cooking, everything was a test. Teeth had to crush, jaws had to tear, stomachs had to fight every bite for its secrets. Hours of chewing, hours of energy just to pull a little more from the raw and the tough. Our ancestors had bones to match the effort, wide jaws, thick molars, massive chewing muscles running up the skull like ropes pulled tight, faces shaped by the war with food. But fire whispered a truce. It told the body, you don't have to fight so hard anymore, and the body responded. It began slowly, less strain in the jaw, less bone needed to support the endless work of chewing. So the face reshaped, inch by inch, generation by generation. The jaw narrowed. The teeth didn't need to be so flat, so large. The skull didn't need those thick ridges for muscle. It softened, changed, and as the jaw shrank, something unexpected happened. There was more room for the voice to deepen, room for language to echo. Cooking didn't just change our diet, it freed us to speak. And that wasn't the only shift. Raw food takes time to chew, time to digest, time to process. But cooked food, it gave back some of that time, some of that energy. Less effort meant more calories absorbed, faster. The gut didn't have to be so large, so complex, so demanding. It shrank. And the energy that had once been tied up in digestion was rerouted to the brain. The moment we started cooking, our brains began to grow. Not in a day, not even in 1,000 days, but it began, and it never stopped. And with that growth came memory, planning, symbol, meaning. Fire let us unlock calories we could never reach before, and with that extra fuel, we built thought, imagination, language, hope. A bigger brain wasn't just an accident, it was fed by flame, fed by change. And so fire carved our evolution without ever touching us directly. It touched the food, and the food touched us. Some of the earliest cooked meals weren't just meat, they were mixtures: berries mashed with fat, bone broth simmered with wild grains, ash-roasted tubers, softened until even the children could eat them. Cooking became its own kind of memory, passed down not through words but through methods. The way something was turned over once, then again, the smell that meant done, the sound of fat dripping into fire, and the way elders nodded when it hissed just right. And as meals grew more complex, so did the hands that prepared them. Dexterity improved, timing mattered, tools emerged, not just to kill, but to cut, stir, grind, carve. Cooking made us smarter because it demanded smartness. Not just survival, but choice. The social part of us shifted too, because when you cook, you wait, you sit, you gather, you share. Meals became reasons to stay in one place, reasons to listen, reasons to be together. And that togetherness shaped our posture, our gaze, the lines of our face, the way we learned to smile, not as threat, but as warmth, as invitation. So yes, cooking changed the shape of our bodies, but more than that, it changed the shape of our time. It gave us evenings, it gave us softness, it gave us something to pass down, not just meat, not just knowledge, but the memory of fire on our breath. The ember that traveled across generations. It didn't look like much, just a faint red glow hidden inside a pouch of moss and bark. Sometimes it sat inside a carved stone bowl, other times it traveled in a curled leaf, folded tight, kept warm against the chest. The ember didn't flare, it didn't shine. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to last, and somehow, it did. Not just through one night, not just through one storm, but through entire generations. It passed from hand to hand, from elder to child, from one long journey to the next. A coal from the old camp, carried across ice, carried through snow, carried down into the valley and up into the caves. It crossed rivers in cupped hands. It crossed time. The ember didn't carry heat alone. It carried stories. This is the ember your mother guarded through the red winter. This is the coal from the fire, lit the day your sister was born. This spark was saved from the fire that burned our first home. And as long as the ember lived, those stories lived with it. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes the ember dimmed so low that only the most skilled hands could revive it. A breath, just right. A curl of dried grass. The slow coaxing of life from what looked like death. And in those moments, you weren't just saving fire, you were saving memory. Some groups gave the ember a name, not the fire itself, but the coal, a name passed down just like a person's, in whispered tones, in moments of ceremony. This is her, the one who waits. This is him, the breath, after the wind. The ember became a companion, a presence, a witness to years even the oldest among them could barely recall. When a new fire was made, it wasn't truly new. It was a continuation, a link. You didn't start a fire, you woke it, gently, with reverence, as if calling someone from sleep, and in that moment, the past flickered back into the present. The ember glowed again, not just with heat, but with history. It meant something. It meant continuity. It meant no matter how far you had traveled, how cold the night had been, or how long the silence had stretched, you still carried something from before. Even in times of loss, when the ember was dropped, or drenched, or stolen by rain, its absence was felt like grief. It wasn't just warmth that was gone, it was connection. People remembered the weight of it in their hands, the hum of heat against their ribs, the way the oldest among them would touch it with 2 fingers before speaking, as if asking permission to remember. So they tried again, they relit it, not always from scratch, but from memory, from flint, from friction, from prayer. They brought it back, not just with tools, but with belief. And over time, they didn't just pass on the ember itself, they passed on the duty of carrying it. Not everyone was chosen. It wasn't just about strength or age, it was about steadiness, about knowing when to stop and check it, when to protect it from wind, when to pull it close at night, when to ask someone else to carry it, not because you failed, but because it needed rest. There are stories buried deep in the oral traditions of some of the oldest peoples on Earth, of coals that crossed continents, tucked into bundles, strapped to the backs of women who walked for days without stopping. Coals that were kept alive through births and deaths, through battles and peace, through migrations so long they became legends. And even today, in places where the modern world hums loud, there are echoes of it. Ceremonial fires that are never allowed to die. Eternal flames tended by quiet hands. Candles lit from other candles, from other candles, from other candles. Flames that trace back, not years but centuries. Because even now, something in us remembers what it means to carry fire forward. Not just for warmth, not just for light, but because it proves we came from somewhere. Because it shows someone came before us, and trusted us to continue. And because someday someone else will need it. Not just the ember, but the story it carries. The ashes that meant you belonged. Ash doesn't cling by accident. It settles. Softly, slowly. Over skin, over hair, into the lines of hands and the creases of leather and hide. It seeps into the cracks of tools. It lingers in the corners of shelters. It coats the ground where people sat, where meals were shared, where stories were told. Ash becomes part of everything. And when it did, you knew you were home. Ash was never just waste. Not then, not in that world. It was memory. It was proof that fire had been there, that warmth had lived in that place, that people had gathered, had waited out storms, had survived another night. Ash was the fingerprint of presence, and the people understood this. When you came back from a hunt, or from scouting new land, you could smell it before you saw it. That dry, faint, burned scent hanging in the air. It clung to hides, hung out to dry. It marked the rocks that circled the fire pit. It stuck to fingertips even after washing in the stream. It coated the bones of old meals stacked in the corner, gnawed clean and silent now. And that was how you knew they hadn't left. The fire had burned. The ashes remained. You were still one of them. Ash meant belonging. Some groups marked themselves with it. A smear across the cheek, a dusting along the forearms, a child's hand dipped in fine ash and pressed to a cave wall. Not just art, but a declaration. I was here. I was one of you. Elders would press a pinch into the center of a newborn's chest, not for magic, but for memory, as if to say, may you always find your way back to the flame. Even the dead were touched by it. Their bodies rubbed with ash before burial, before burning, before sending them into whatever silence followed. Ash was both a goodbye and a reminder. They had lived in the circle. They had shared the warmth. They had mattered. And when a traveler came from far away, cold, wet, carrying stories and silence, the clan would sometimes offer no words, no welcome. Just a hand dipped into cooled ash, reached out, pressed gently to the traveler's shoulder. You're one of us now. No fire burned forever, not even the most carefully tended. Some nights the coals gave in, the wind won, the fuel ran out, but the ash remained, and from it the next fire could begin, with patience, with breath, with hands that knew what they were doing. Children were taught this, not just how to build a flame, but how to read the ash, what it said about the wood, about the weather, about the ones who had sat near it before. How dark ash meant fast-burning fuel. How white ash meant a long hot fire that had lasted well into morning. How scattered ash meant movement, maybe a quarrel. How carefully piled ash meant a story had been told for hours. In time, even strangers learned to look for it. Not all smoke meant welcome, but ash was different. Ash said they had stayed, that they had cooked, that someone had laughed here, or wept, or watched the stars with tired eyes, that someone had fed the fire, and by doing so had fed the people. You could fake many things, but you couldn't fake the ashes. You had to live them. And when the camp moved, as it often did, the people would scatter a handful of ash at the edge of where the fire had been, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a word, sometimes just with a glance. It was a way of leaving a part of themselves behind, a signal to the earth, to the animals, to the wind. We were here. Years later, when another group passed through that place and found that faint crust of grey, they would nod. Someone had belonged here. Someone had endured. They might even add their own ash to the spot, not to claim it, but to honor it. To say, we are part of what came before. That's how memory spread without writing. That's how history moved. Not in books, not in stones, but in ash. Over time, some fires were built, not for warmth, not for cooking, but for legacy. Fires meant to burn low and long, creating ash that would be used in ceremony, in rites of passage, in stories passed down by firelight. Ash carried lessons, warnings, names, and the greatest honor was not being given fire, it was being trusted with the ash, because fire fades. But ashes stay. Ashes linger where words fail, they coat the soul in quiet proof. They tell you someone fed this flame, someone stayed through the dark, and now, so have you. You belong. When fire became a memory worth passing on, it's one thing to use fire, it's another to remember it. There was a time when fire was only reaction, a thing found, feared, fed, when it arrived, then lost when it went out. Lightning struck a dry tree, a spark leapt from rock to brush, and for a while it burned, and for a while it warmed, and when it died, so did that moment. Gone. Nothing carried forward but the heat it gave, and the food it softened. But then came a different kind of moment, one where fire wasn't just used, it was remembered, not just how it moved, but what it meant. They began to speak of it, not only as light, not only as warmth, but as an event. The night we sat, and the flame never flickered. The day the wind blew sideways and the fire bent with us. The morning the deer passed just beyond its glow, unafraid. Fire was no longer a thing that happened. It became part of the story, and then it became the reason for the story. Whole generations began building fires, not just to cook or survive, but to gather, to speak, to recall. Children leaned close to the flame as the elders recounted the time a single ember had been carried across an entire winter. They learned which woods cracked too loudly, which ones smoked too long, and which glowed the longest without needing more. They remembered the time the flame danced as someone passed, and the silence that followed after. It wasn't just utility anymore, it was ceremony, it was memory, and the stories weren't only about the fire, they were told because of it. The presence of flame made the voice slow down, it made listeners lean in, it made truths feel heavier and dreams feel closer. Around the fire the world became smaller, just you, your people, and the breath between sparks, so they kept lighting it. Night after night, even when food was scarce, even when danger lurked nearby, even when the wood was damp and the wind restless, they still tried, because what they were preserving wasn't just heat. It was inheritance, it was the understanding that this flame wasn't born here. It came from someone's hands before you. It came from a coal your mother saved in her sleeve, from the flint your grandfather knapped with trembling fingers, from the story your people never let go. When fire became a memory worth passing on, it also became a responsibility. Some were chosen, not the strongest, not the loudest, but the ones who listened best, the ones who noticed when the smoke changed color, the ones who stirred coals without waking others, the ones who could sit still long enough to hear when the flame needed more. Those were the fire keepers. They didn't just tend to light, they tended to the group's past, and when one passed away, their fire wasn't just put out, it was watched, it was held, a final ember, wrapped in ash, given to another, and that ember whispered, "Continue." Even when villages moved, even when rivers dried up and herds disappeared, the fire, and the memory of fire remained. It moved with them, lit in new caves, built in new pits, reborn each time someone remembered why it mattered. Eventually they stopped calling it just fire. They gave it names, personal ones, sacred ones. They spoke to it like kin, because it wasn't just the warmth that kept them alive, it was the story inside it. And when someone new was born, they weren't introduced to the world in silence, they were brought to the fire, shown its glow, let to feel the air rise with its breath, and told, "This is the thing we carry." Even when all else is lost, they understood something that we're only beginning to remember now, that warmth is not just physical, that light is not just what lets you see, that a flame is not just what burns wood, it's what gives time shape, it's what gives memory weight, it's what gives belonging a center. Because when the winds changed and the trees fell, and the years wore down even the hardest stone, the memory of fire still remained. In the voice, in the ash, in the breath passed from one story to the next. That's when fire became something else entirely. Not just a tool, not just a trick, but the first thing we ever chose to remember, and the last thing we ever dared to forget. Why we still stare into it, even now. We don't need it anymore. Not really, not in the way we once did. We have electric lights, stoves, radiators that hum in the walls and glow from beneath the floorboards. We press buttons, flip switches. The dark isn't dark anymore, not unless we want it to be. Cold is no longer something we answer with flame, but with code, with climate control, with comfort measured in degrees and settings and apps. And yet, we still stare into it, into the fire, even now. We light them in backyards, at campsites, on quiet nights when the wind feels older than it should. We gather around, not because we're freezing, not because we need to cook, but because something deep inside still leans toward the glow. We don't even notice it, not at first. The way the conversation slows down, the way our shoulders relax, the way our eyes drift not toward each other, but toward the flicker, that slow, soft movement of flame and ember. It's not a show, it's not a screen, it doesn't ask for attention, and still, it gets it. Every time. We stare into fire because something remembers, something in us that was once shaped by it, over generations, over the slow unfolding of time. It's not about survival now, it's about recognition. When we look into fire, we're not just seeing heat or light, we're seeing what once made us feel safe, what once drew our clans together in the cold, what gave shape to the night and space for our first words, what let us pause long enough to become human. And deep down, we know that, even if we don't say it, even if we laugh around the fire, or drink, or sing, or let it burn in silence, a part of us is always listening, always remembering. This is the thing that waited with us through the longest nights. This is the thing that ate wood and gave back warmth. The thing we passed from hand to hand, from forest to field, from one century into another, never letting it go out. We stare into fire because it's the only thing that's been with us since the beginning. Because even when we forgot how to make it, or feared it, or almost lost it, we came back to it, again and again. And now, we still do. Not because we must, but because we choose to. Because staring into flame doesn't just bring comfort, it brings continuity. A reminder that, across all the changes, all the miles, all the centuries, something stayed, something glows in the center, something still dances with shadows and speaks without words. That's why we still stare into it. Not because of what it is now, but because of what it is now, but because of what it's always been. Hey friends, thank you for spending time with the Useless Historian. You've just listened to the final chapter of why fire changed human evolution more than anything else. If this long, quiet story helped you drift into thought, into memory, or even into sleep, I'd love it if you gave the video a like, subscribed to the channel, and maybe even shared it with someone who needs a little calm tonight. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Until next time, stay curious, and may the light find you gently.